War is often sold as a clash of leaders, borders, flags, and ideals. But underneath every mobilized army, every factory shift, every convoy at sea, there is a quieter force doing the real work: finance. Because before a nation can fight, it must pay. Not once, but every day, at a scale that normal budgets cannot survive. This is the story of the money behind the great wars, how governments raise it, hide its cost, stretch it through debt, and sometimes destroy their own currencies trying to keep the war machine moving. If you want more documentary stories that explain how power actually works, through systems, incentives, and hidden mechanics, subscribe and follow the channel. The first truth of war finance is simple. War is too expensive to pay for honestly. In peacetime, governments can fund themselves through taxes and routine borrowing. But a major war is a different creature. It demands a sudden surge in spending: soldiers, weapons, logistics, food supply, shipping, intelligence, medical care, pensions, reconstruction. The bill arrives faster than taxes can be collected, faster than parliaments can negotiate, and faster than voters can accept. So governments turn to three classic tools: taxation, borrowing, and money creation. Each one has a cost, and each one has a political advantage. Taxes are the most straightforward. They transfer resources from citizens to the state. But taxes are visible. They produce outrage. They force the public to feel the war in their wallets right now. Borrowing is easier. It allows a government to say, "We will pay later." The cost becomes delayed, spread across years, pushed onto future taxpayers. Borrowing also helps politically because it can be framed as patriotism. Buy war bonds, support the troops, do your part. Money creation is the most dangerous and the most tempting. It can appear painless at first. The government can pay suppliers, wages, and contracts without asking permission from taxpayers or lenders. But it is not free. It is a hidden tax, paid through rising prices and weakened purchasing power. And this is where the economics of destruction begins to look less like strategy and more like survival. Here is a question worth sitting with. When a government decides to go to war, which group actually pays first? Those alive now, or those not yet born? Leave your answer in the comments. In the great wars of the modern era, the how of financing shaped the what of history. Take the First World War. The war did not just destroy lives. It tore through financial systems that had taken decades to stabilize. Many countries entered the war under versions of a gold standard, currencies tied, directly or indirectly, to gold reserves. That system imposed discipline. You could not expand money supply freely without consequences. War made discipline impossible. Governments needed funds immediately. They suspended gold convertibility, expanded credit, issued debt, and pushed central banks to support the war effort. The logic was clear: win first, settle accounts later. But later arrived as inflation, debt overhang, social unrest, and political extremism. One detail is often missed. War spending doesn't just add to a budget, it changes the entire price system. When the state becomes the largest buyer in the economy, it competes for steel, coal, fuel, labor, shipping space. Contracts are rushed, quality standards shift, and scarcity appears. That scarcity drives prices up, and governments respond by paying more, often with newly created credit. Even without printing banknotes, wartime finance can expand through the banking system as loans, government securities, and central bank support. War debt does not simply vanish when peace is declared. It becomes a permanent pressure on the state. And then came an additional shock: reparations and war settlements. When one country is forced to transfer wealth to another, often in hard currency or goods, the losing side is trapped. It must extract resources from a damaged economy to pay external obligations. This can force austerity, destabilize currencies, and fracture politics. The financial aftermath of war became, in many places, a second war, fought through budgets, exchange rates, and collapsing trust. That is one reason the period between the world wars was so volatile. Not only because of ideology or borders, but because the financial architecture had been bent and cracked. Then comes the Second World War, and the scale increases again. By the late 1930s and early 1940s, the industrial capacity of entire nations is redirected toward war production. Civilian output is rationed. Consumer goods are restricted. Labor is organized, sometimes coerced. The economy becomes a war economy, a system designed not to maximize comfort, but to maximize output for conflict. Financing that machine required coordination between governments, banks, and central institutions at a level that would have been unthinkable in normal times. And here is the key. Major war changes what money is allowed to do. In peacetime, inflation is treated as a failure. In wartime, moderate inflation can be tolerated, even welcomed, because it helps governments reduce the real burden of debt. If prices rise, the value of old debt shrinks in real terms, meaning the state can repay what it owes with cheaper money later. That is why war and inflation often travel together. Not always explosively, but structurally. So how do governments prevent wartime finance from spiraling into hyperinflation? They use controls, price controls, wage controls, rationing, capital controls, forced savings, special taxes, propaganda, and, most importantly, mass bond campaigns. War bonds are not merely fundraising, they are inflation management. When citizens buy bonds, they give money to the government and receive a promise of future repayment. That money is removed from circulation, reducing immediate demand for scarce goods. It is a way to fund war while suppressing the inflation that war spending would otherwise ignite. In some countries, the bond campaign becomes an emotional ritual. Posters, radio messages, school programs, celebrities, community drives. Finance becomes culture. Buying debt becomes loyalty. And it works. Until it doesn't. Because bonds are only as strong as confidence in the state's future. If a government loses or collapses or defaults, the bonds become paper. If inflation runs, the repayment becomes meaningless. The bondholder learns the harshest lesson of all. Not all promises are equal. A second mechanism also appears in major wars. What economists later called financial repression. Governments cap interest rates, push banks to hold government debt, and restrict where savings can go. The goal is simple. Keep borrowing costs low so the state can fund conflict. In practice, it means savers are quietly taxed. Their returns are held below inflation, and the difference transfers purchasing power to the government over time. This is war finance as design. Not a single policy, but a system built to funnel national resources into one priority. After 1945, the world tried to build guardrails to prevent another financial collapse turning into another political disaster. That is where a new system emerges, one that tries to anchor currencies, rebuild trade, and restore trust. Exchange rate rules, new institutions, reconstruction programs, and a commitment to prevent the competitive devaluations that helped destabilize the interwar period. But even that system carries a secret. War doesn't stop. It changes form. The most visible change is the rise of permanent defense spending. In earlier eras, war spending spiked and then fell. After the Great Wars, many countries, especially major powers, maintained large militaries, intelligence networks, and defense industries permanently. The economy now had a war sector embedded inside it, even in peace. And that creates a new set of incentives. A permanent defense sector produces jobs, contracts, lobbying power, and strategic dependence. It becomes politically difficult to shrink. It also becomes a vehicle for technological development, some of it civilian, some of it military. This is one reason the economics of destruction can become self-sustaining. Destruction generates demand, and demand generates industry, and industry generates influence. Then there is the modern mechanism that changes everything, the ability of powerful states to borrow cheaply in their own currency. If a country's currency is trusted globally, used for trade, reserves, and financial settlement, it can finance deficits at lower cost. In practical terms, it can sustain large military spending and large borrowing without immediately triggering a currency crisis. This does not mean war becomes free. It means the costs move. They can move into future debt service, into inflation risk, into currency devaluation, into cuts elsewhere, into social programs that never get funded because the interest bill grows. Sometimes the cost moves abroad. Sanctions, resource control, trade disruptions, these become financial weapons. The battlefield expands. War is no longer only fought with tanks and planes. It is fought through credit lines, payment systems, insurance markets, shipping routes, and commodity pricing. And the public often doesn't feel it immediately, because the financing is engineered to be invisible. That invisibility is a feature, not a bug. Because if war had to be funded solely through direct taxation, many wars would end before they began. So the economics of destruction relies on distance. Distance between decision and payment. Distance between the policy elite and the average citizen. Distance between borrowing today and paying tomorrow. Which brings us to the most uncomfortable truth in this story. War finance is not only about money, it is about consent. When citizens are asked to pay directly, consent becomes explicit. When the cost is hidden in deficits and inflation, consent becomes assumed. If you had to choose one, would you rather pay for war through higher taxes today or through debt and inflation that shows up later? Tell me why in the comments. The Great Wars left behind more than ruins. They reshaped how modern states work. They normalized central banking as a partner of government financing. They expanded taxation systems permanently. They created administrative states capable of mobilizing entire societies. They accelerated industrial scale, logistics, surveillance, and propaganda. And they taught governments a lesson they never forgot. In crisis, the public will accept what it would reject in peace. That lesson can be used for survival. It can also be abused. Because once a society builds the machinery to finance destruction, that machinery does not disappear when the guns fall silent. It waits. It adapts. It looks for new threats, some real, some exaggerated, some manufactured. And the money keeps moving. Factories keep producing, contracts keep renewing, budgets keep expanding, debt keeps rolling forward. The day-to-day reality becomes a world where peace is a headline, but war is a line item. So what is the ultimate cost of the money behind the Great Wars? It is not only the interest paid on bonds. It is not only the inflation that erodes wages. It is not only the taxes that grow and never fully shrink. It is the quiet transformation of a society's priorities, when resources that could have built schools, infrastructure, and health are redirected into systems designed to destroy. The economics of destruction is not simply an event. It is an architecture. And once it exists, it will always find a reason to justify itself. Because the most profitable machine is the one that claims it is necessary. And the most dangerous spending is the kind that becomes normal. To see how deep this goes, look at what happened inside the plumbing. In the Second World War, for example, the United States financed the fight with a mix of higher taxes, mass bond sales, and central bank support. Income taxes expanded dramatically, payroll withholding made payment automatic, and the Federal Reserve kept interest rates low so the Treasury could borrow at scale. That combination, tax capacity, captive savings, and rate control, created a template many states copied later. Britain used a different version of the same logic: heavy taxation, strict rationing, and controls designed to prevent wartime demand from overwhelming a limited supply of goods. The point was not comfort. The point was keeping the currency and the home front from collapsing while resources were pushed to the battlefield. And for countries that could not borrow credibly, the path was darker. If lenders doubt victory, they demand higher rates, or refuse entirely. Then the state leans harder on the printing press and the currency becomes the shock absorber. That is how some wars end, not only with surrender, but with the destruction of savings, the collapse of markets, and social radicalization. War also creates a shadow economy. Whenever prices are capped and goods are rationed, black markets appear. That is not just crime, it is information. It is a signal that the official price system no longer matches reality. Governments fight that shadow economy with enforcement and propaganda. But the underlying driver remains: scarcity plus money. One more mechanism matters: external financing. In major conflicts, allies often fund each other through loans, grants, or supplies. This can keep a partner fighting long after its domestic resources are exhausted. But it also creates post-war obligations and dependencies. The war ends, and the balance sheet remains. All of this changes how nations behave after the shooting stops. Budgets are rebuilt around debt service. Political coalitions form around veterans' benefits, reconstruction contracts, and industrial policy. Inflation becomes a recurring fear, and central banks are pushed, sometimes quietly, sometimes openly, into a permanent role as crisis backstops.